Good evening to all, and welcome to our final session of the 2026 Plastic Advocates webinar series. My name is Dana Ripper. I'm with the Missouri River Bird Observatory, also known as MRBO. With us tonight is my MRBO co-founder and co-director, Ethan Duke. We're very happy to see people here for our final session. At MRBO, our mission is the conservation of wildlife and their habitats through science, education, and advocacy. And one of the most significant projects of our organization is the Show Me Less Plastic project, which is a collaborative 3-year project between MRBO and our really awesome partner, Missouri Stream Teams United. As usual on these series, I'm going to put a few links in the chat for some upcoming plastic-related events. These are going to be all in person here in Missouri. We have in just a couple days a community plastic workshop coming up in Marshall, Missouri, where Ethan and I are broadcasting from tonight. That is Wednesday the 18th. On Saturday the 28th, we have a workshop at Mark Twain Lake Boudreaux Visitor Center. I'm happy to announce for folks joining us from the Kansas City area, we are going to have our first community plastic workshop on that side of the state in KC on April 11th. And then just announced the team is doing a workshop in Rolla on May 9th. So I'm about to put all of those in the chat at the same time. There you go for registration links for those. And without any further ado, we're going to go right on to our webinar of the evening. We're very pleased to welcome tonight's speakers, Rooney and Madison Dennis. Luz is a human rights and environmental activist. She holds a master's degree in nonprofit management from Washington University in St. Louis, a Law of Sea certificate from the British Institute of International and Comparative Law, and a Universal Periodic Review and the UN Human Rights Systems certificate from the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. She is trained by Judith Enck, founder and president of Beyond Plastics, and she's the co-founder of Beyond Plastics Missouri, Wisconsin. In 2021, Luz hosted a 3-part webinar series on plastic pollution, which featured experts in the field from the Netherlands, India, the Philippines, and the US who discussed recycling misconceptions and the latest research in microplastics. And Luz, sometime tonight, if you have a handy link for that series, I'd love for you to put it in the chat whenever it's convenient. Madison Dennis is a project manager for Plastic Pollution Coalition. She has over 6 years of experience in environmental advocacy and communications and currently leads Plastic Pollution Coalition's wide breadth of advocacy and policy initiatives. She has been deeply engaged in the negotiations for a UN plastic treaty, attending negotiations in Canada, South Korea, and most recently in Switzerland, working with country delegations, businesses, scientists, and organizations to enact a strong binding treaty that reduces plastic production and protects human health. She also manages the Global Plastic Law Database and Resource Center, tracking past global plastic legislation at the local, state, and provincial, national, and international levels. Previously, she led grassroots campaigns to protect marine wildlife, reduce electronic waste, and bolster renewable energy. In her work, Madison prioritizes systems-based collaborative solutions that center the impacted communities and environment. So welcome to you both, and please take it right away.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you for this introduction, and thank you for inviting us to be part of this conversation. Thank you, Madison, for agreeing to present with me. So this evening, what I'm going to do is I'm going to speak to you about the International Plastics Treaty, an overview of the program and how it's structured. And I hope that this moves. All right. So an overview of the mandate for the legally binding treaty. It started on March 22nd, 2022, where 165 nations agreed to begin writing the protocols for the treaty, with the aim to finish the language for the treaty in 2024. And we know today that this did not happen. The treaty is supposed to include both mandatory and voluntary approaches regarding plastic production and plastic management, and also to address the full cycle of plastic. Some of the things that the mandate also wants to do is to incorporate of having to consideration other conventions within the United Nations. Because they have these conventions have articles in them that had to do with reporting, with funding, with requirements for countries, and so it gives a foundation to add to the language of the treaty. So for example, in the conventions that I mentioned here, the Basel Convention works for transboundary of chemicals actually, and it handles the prohibition of exporting waste, for example, to developing countries. The Rio Declaration on Environment and Development is one that has an article, and I can't remember if it's Article 16 or 17, that actually has a clause for polluters to pay. And so when the United Nations or the team, the bureau that is handling the negotiations, they need to look at all the different items of these conventions that can be added to the treaty and how this is going to affect the actual language of the program. Securing financial sources to implement the treaty is also a mandate within the United Nations. So this looks a little busy at the moment, and I'm not sure that guys can all see this entire chart. But the Bureau for the negotiations includes the chair, the vice chair, and the rapporteur. The chair has the option has the mandate actually to organize contact groups. I'm only adding 3 groups over here. A chair can mandate to have 4 different contact groups. Every group needs to have 2 co-chairs, and the first group has to have 3 subgroups, and the second one has to have 2 subgroups. And the way this is divided is because these subgroups are given the task to evaluate different parts of the treaty as the language is being written and revised. There's also a legal team that comes nominated from the 5 different UN region groups, which includes the African countries, Asia Pacific countries, the Eastern European countries, Western Europe, and Latin America, and the Caribbean. The U.S. is not part of any of these groups, but for voting purposes, they vote under the Western European group.
Hey, Luz, I'm
Yes.
really sorry to interrupt you, but a few people have asked if you could speak up a little bit more. I think your volume is a little lower than
Okay.
ours for whatever reason.
Okay, I
Thanks.
apologize. I'll get closer. So the timeline that we have for the negotiations, again, this began in 2022. It was supposed to be completed by 2024, which didn't happen. And so on November to December 2022, the first meeting happened in Uruguay, where Ambassador Gustavo Velasquez was inaugurated as the chair of the negotiations. And at this point, what they were trying to do is trying to figure out what were the goals and of really addressing to be addressed in the treaty. Were they going to be focusing on management of waste, controls of production, finances? What was the part of what was the main goal of the program, and to figure out how the different groups within the United Nations were to be organized from the member states to have their own regional conventions or conferences for the UN and the treaty team to have input from the different organizations. As the days progress, the second treaty negotiation was in Paris, France in 2023. And at these negotiations, there was a request for the chair, which was Ambassador Velasquez, to come out with a 0 draft test to give a foundation for looking at how the language of the treaty was going to be divided. And again, it has to include not only protocols as to what needs to be addressed but also the mechanisms of how this is going to be, financial mechanisms as to how countries are going to pay to implement the treaty in their countries. The third negotiation, the draft is released and discussed, and Ambassador um, Luis Baez from Ecuador was elected to continue the negotiations through number 4 and number 5, which happened in Canada and in Busan in South Korea. At this point, when the draft is released, the area of caps on reduction of production of plastics began to have impact or from the petrochemical companies that don't want to deal with reducing plastic production. For the negotiations in Canada, the test was revised, but again, there was a lot of push from the industry now to not only have caps on plastic production, but also on how is this going to be financed and whether or not there were going to be any legislation, anything. The UN cannot force companies into legislation, but there were the talks about the responsibility of the producers to pay for the damage that they have caused began to surface in the negotiations. In South Korea, this was supposed to be the last time for the actual test to be finalized, but it didn't happen. And again, we have a lot of issues from the petroleum companies who did not want to address anything to do with capping production of plastics. At these negotiations in Geneva last year, the emphasis was on the impacts of plastics in human health, and microplastics was part of the conversation. And there were a lot of problems with the negotiations in Geneva because we had the lobbyists from the industry that almost outnumber the number of member states participating in the negotiations. And this year, on February 7th, a new chair for the negotiations that had not been released as to when they will begin took place. And even in the selection of the new chair for the treaty, even at the negotiations, the industry was countries that produce the producers of oil were delaying the process of the election, as requesting that they needed 1 more hour to be able to evaluate the 3 candidates that were being selected for voting the chair. And here we have a country, member state oil producer requesting 1 hour extra to evaluate a process that was already had taken place, and delaying most likely 1 hour from responses from other member states who did not agree to this request of 1 more hour to evaluate the candidates to be elected. So some of the trends that we have seen with the in themes that we have seen during the negotiations, and the first one, there was the discussion of whether this treaty that is supposed to be legally binding, and we don't know still what happens if a country doesn't agree to follow the rules of whatever the treaty ends us to be. We wanted to know whether this was going to be a mandatory or voluntary, and the problem would be in a voluntary option for national plans to reduce plastic pollution. Is something that gets back into countries deciding on their own and not following the rules or the protocols that the treaty imposes. Financial assistance was another problem because there's always the situation where developed countries that have gone to take oil from developing countries do not want to deal with the repercussions of paying for damage in the environment or the impacts in indigenous communities. In this treaty, waste speakers were included, or were the idea of including indigenous peoples and waste speakers was also addressed, because they were trying to be inclusive in who needed to be at the table for the negotiations. On the second and third negotiations, the accountability of the producers and was beginning to take form and discussion. So extended producer responsibility began to take shape, and the reduction of microplastics again is something that came into conversation in the banning of certain polymers that are related to health problems, especially cancer. But the third one, with the Basel Convention that is working on the regulation of movement of waste, there was a lot of emphasis on the exporting of waste into developing countries that do not have the infrastructure, especially to deal with the amount of plastic that comes from developing countries, including the US, and UK, and many European countries. And with the final one, the theme of the chemicals are concerned, and whether or not who has the last say on what chemicals are concerned need to be not only eliminated from the plastics, but also legislated, if anything. In human health, especially microplastics, were part of the conversation, which was important. Problems that we had with the lobbyists who are attending the negotiations has grown from 94 in Paris to 234 lobbyists who almost, you know, were representing more than the countries that came into the negotiations. 19 lobbyists from the industry actually registered as part of delegation from countries. So that was the worst scenario, because those 19 delegates who registered, lobbyists who registered, actually had access to actual negotiation of the text for the treaty, which creates a problem. So my support or my involvement with the negotiations in Geneva came at one of the thematic meetings where Benjamin Wong had a presentation with the mayor of Geneva, and there was a request for volunteers to help in the documentation, but that was sent. There was a tiny blueprint saying that they were also looking for remote support. Benjamin Wong is a Canadian artist and activist. He organizes this art installations, organized these installations throughout the negotiations in every city that has happened. And in this case, his effort was to bring into the attention of human health during the negotiations. He utilized the Thinker, which is a statue of a philosophy, and he adjusted this to be for the statue to be sitting down by Mother Earth and holding a baby, to bring into attention the health impact of plastics that is impacting a child, a human being, even an unborn child. And so trying to bring this awareness to the public was important. So every day of the negotiation, and he had a team of volunteers and artists and all of this, who every day of the negotiations, they will bring more plastic to the statue until the end of the negotiations, where the amount of plastic would reach almost the top of the shoulders of the statue. And the remote support that I presented to the group was to help with research. I had to evaluate 30 pages, 25 pages of research because they were using some of they were quoting some of the research, scientific research related to the health impacts of plastics. And I needed, my job was to make sure that the quotes were proper, that the research was appropriate and just making sure that the information was correct. I also, because I've been attending the thematic meetings for so long, I had a lot of information about nonprofits in Europe that I knew were going to be in attendance. And so making those connections, and especially connections with the United Nations media team, because they were more focused on the negotiations inside and what the different ministers of environment or climate or were talking about, and the different delegates, and not paying attention to exactly what was happening, how human health was being highlighted with this art installation. I also was able to translate the script of the documentary into Spanish, and so they created a documentary of how this entire process went, which I have in the resource file. The team that is coming for the next negotiations, which I have no clue when they will begin, because the chair, Ambassador Julio Cordano, here in the second picture, was just elected in February. This will be the team that is going to lead the next negotiations. Jyoti is the secretary, but her name is not here, I'm not sure what happened. She's the executive secretary of the INC Secretariat, the International Intergovernmental Committee that is hosting the treaty. Ambassador Cordano is going to be the chair. He is from Chile. Mr. Christian is coming as the vice chair for the program. Again, this team is a team that has a lot of experience in international negotiations and in environmental and foreign affairs programs. And Irma Gurguliani is going to be the rapporteur. The role of the rapporteur is to document everything that happens within the negotiations. There's a lot of feedback that needs to be coordinated when the member states and the NGOs participate in the negotiations. A lot of documentation that needs to be put in place and to summarize. And with that, I will give the floor to my colleague Madison to continue with the presentation. Thank you. We'll take questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Luz. That was a really excellent background on the INC processes and how we got here. I'm just going to quickly share my screen to talk a little bit more about where we are now and some tools that we can use to track progress. So, Okay, so as was mentioned, I'm a project manager with Plastic Pollution Coalition. I manage all of our advocacy and policy initiatives, and I've been point for the UN treaty negotiations. My presentation today will focus on global policy, particularly on updates from INC 5.2 and the path forward, and then also covering the Global Plastic Law Database and Resource Center, which is a database that I manage with external partners to track plastic laws all around the world. So as I mentioned, I'll start off with a quick debrief of INC 5.2. This was the third negotiation that I have attended on behalf of my organization, primarily focused on pushing the US to have a stronger stance, but can share more on that. Then also looking forward to INC 5.4, what do we need to be successful, covering the Global Plastic Law Database, and then taking questions at the end. So I skip INC 5.3 because, as was mentioned by Luz, it was only one day to elect a new chair. The last textual negotiations were INC 5.2, which happened in Geneva, Switzerland in August of 2025. So that week concluded without any agreed upon draft text. Essentially, the delegations were not able to agree on a new draft that aimed to pare down the initial proposed language from what was proposed in Busan and agreed upon in Busan. So with the failure to advance any agreed upon text, The negotiations will now revert to the latest draft text that was agreed upon by the committee, which was from INC 5.2 in South Korea. And for a little intel on what that looks like, it's hundreds of pages long and it includes many brackets, which essentially means it has a treaty text that incorporates all of the many different proposals from different countries, which really, presents a wide array of paths forward. And what we're really needing to do is pare that down to an agreed upon text. So, as you may have seen in the media, INC 5.2 was loudly proclaimed a failure. And there are very significant flaws to the current process that I'll be getting into now. But I want to highlight that despite these flaws, there is a very clear path forward. It is not without its hurdles. But why the media really called it a flawed process was one, the lack of an agreement on substantive text. Also, we saw huge conflicts of interest. As Luz mentioned, there was over 234 industry lobbyists present, and that's only what we can ascertain from essentially the registration of who registered as a lobbyist. This is really makes progress very difficult because the people who profit off of plastic pollution are actually having, in some ways, a direct say in how countries are negotiating. As was mentioned, they're on some of the actual delegations, so they are able to participate when they are discussing between countries, and that's makes progress really, really difficult when you have, essentially the perpetrator helping decide the laws that will eventually regulate this industry. And there's also outnumbering, delegations from many of the small island states, the European Union bloc as a whole, and then also scientists and indigenous groups, which is very troubling when the people who are most impacted and the people who know the impacts, the ins and outs of the health and environmental impacts are not being centered. Throughout the negotiations, observers were also held at an arm's distance, which is very difficult. There needs to be transparency in these processes. And we saw that increasingly at INC 5.2, many of the negotiations moved behind closed doors. So observers were not able to witness and to hold countries accountable for their positions. And also many of these informals were not with the entire country, with all of the countries present, but it was focused on particular countries who were posing problems in the process. Also, there's little to no space for observer statements in plenaries where the floor is open. And that is very troubling again, because we need to be centering impacted communities, whether that be youth statements from indigenous groups, women's groups, scientists. There is very little space for that in these negotiations. And then lastly, a huge barrier to progress is consensus-based negotiation. So in a UN body, there are opportunities to either be consensus-based, where everyone must agree, or to use voting to advance measures. In this process, rules of procedure have not been agreed upon, which means that they are defaulting to consensus-based negotiations, which is very difficult when you have petrostates, so countries who are very deeply embedded in petrochemical processes and fossil fuels, going by the name the like-minded group, are able to block basically all upstream measures. So things like reducing plastic production, which of course would have the largest impact on pollution, that is being largely taken off the table when petrostates are able to utilize consensus. And we know we need to go upstream to really address plastic pollution, and they're making that very difficult and have largely been unwilling to negotiate. We've seen ambitious countries walk back their positions to try and find common ground, but the petrostates have red lines that really block anything substantive. And then we've also seen that the small minority of allowed countries have been valued over the majority of delegations. So there are textual proposals that were signed by a majority of countries that were not implemented into draft text, which shows a really problematic preference for some of the larger petrostate countries. While it was largely heralded as a failure, I do want to mention that there was real successes on the ground in Geneva. We had a huge movement of people from the Break Free from Plastic movement, from science, from indigenous communities all around the world who were really there to ensure that ambitious countries held the line and ensured that a weak treaty was not advanced. And so we really saw that as a success. Ambitious countries blocked the passage of a weak proposed text from the chair that would have only further ingrained us in the plastic pollution crisis for years to come. Would have really been a waste management treaty primarily, where we know that plastic pollutes across its full life cycle and needs to be holistically regulated and managed. But these ambitious countries, by blocking the advancement of this weaker treaty text, have left the door open for more ambitious and more critical measures. And we know that the movement is really growing. We've seen throughout this year, the news has widely covered some of the health research that's been coming out on plastic pollution. I think it's a bipartisan issue. People across the aisle want to reduce plastic pollution and its impact on their health. And so I think while there are significant hurdles, I will say that the movement is growing and there are still lots of opportunity. Now, when we're looking forward at INC 5.4, I wanted to touch a little bit on what an effective treaty must include. So this is what a treaty needs to essentially effectively address this global transboundary issue. And this is by no means a comprehensive list of measures that need to be included, but some of the key ones that are really our red lines and key things that we are advocating for as an organization, but also as part of the Break Free for Plastic movement. So an effective treaty must include binding measures, a way to hold countries accountable to the language that was agreed upon. We've seen, for example, with the Paris Climate Accord, where when some of these agreements are aspirational and without enforcement mechanisms or binding mechanisms, it is very easy to go back on promises and for very little progress to be made. So it needs to have binding measures. It also needs to reduce plastic production. We often use the analogy of the tap. So we have a bathtub and we've turned the faucet on and it's pouring water out at an unmanageable rate. And we can either take a mop and try and continually mop up the floor, or we can turn off the tap. That is what we need to do with plastic production. It's an insurmountable problem if we don't start reducing it at source. We also need to ban and phase out chemicals of concern and problematic plastic products. So when we think of chemicals of concern, it's like PFAS, it's the bisphenols, it's the phthalates, which have been well studied and documented to have negative impacts on human and environmental health. And then also avoiding very easily avoidable plastic products, whether that be like the single-use straw, whether it be the small little packet of ketchup, trying to really minimize those, again, at source. And then also spurring solutions. So things like reuse systems that can not only spur local economies, but create a truly circular system where we're reusing either stainless steel or glass products that can just avoid some of the plastics entirely, especially in our food and beverage systems. And then throughout, we need to center human rights, science, and health. That is really why we're here to negotiate a treaty. And the conflicts of interest with industry have made that very difficult. And we need to ensure that the health of people and the environment is at the center of this negotiation process. There's also a few more mechanical things that must be incorporated into INC 5.4 for it to be effective. And we know that right now there is no announced date for INC 5.4 because the new chair working with delegations needs to address some of the hurdles that I had mentioned. So in order for future negotiations to be successful, as pertaining to the nonprofit observer community, we need voting on substantive matters. Consensus has formed a really difficult gridlock and very little progress is currently being made. We need protections for observer participation. Again, it's super critical that the people who are most impacted are in the room, are able to hear the negotiations and hold countries accountable for their positions and ensure that they're really committing to what they have publicly stated and what their country has committed to. So we need to ensure that they are included in the process throughout. It's also extremely important that the text proposals, what we call conference room papers that are put forward that have the majority of countries supporting, are put into the draft text that will then be voted on for the basis of negotiations. We saw that in the past there was conference room papers or textual proposals put forward that had more than the majority of countries signed on, and they were not incorporated into the draft, which just shows a very problematic preferential treatment or more consideration for what are the global powers or the petro-states in the room. And then also it's super critical that we minimize conflicts of interest, that delegations are getting industry off of their delegations, that industry participation is managed, and so that observers, scientists, and countries acting for the good of people and the environment are really prioritized and have the space that they need. So that's a little bit on the Global Plastics Treaty process. What I will say is that while it is a very difficult process, we know that plastic policy, plastic advocacy has long been led by local communities. It's groups like the Missouri River Bird Observatory and other like Beyond Plastics, for example, who are working in community to really advance solutions, to identify the problems in their own communities and to pass laws. So with that in mind, Plastic Pollution Coalition, working with external partners, the Environmental Law Alliance Worldwide, Surfrider Foundation, and Break Free from Plastic Europe, created a database that tracks all of the plastic legislation that has been passed, really exemplifying the tried and true policy solutions that can not only inform the treaty process, but also coordinate global efforts. And as I mentioned, it tracks the full life cycle of plastics from extraction and production legislation all the way to waste management legislation. And it's working at the local, the national, and the international level. And it's all inputted by local experts with first language knowledge. We say laws are like poetry. Translation is super critical, especially when it's done by someone with the local context, because the use of words can be applied in a variety of different ways. So this is just a little bit of a preview of the database. So we have what will soon be over 1,500 laws from all around the world. You can see that the countries in blue are the ones that have plastic legislation passed, and then it is broken down into the jurisdiction level. And it's really, we have a map function and a search function so you can dive in. That's a great way to look at what legislation has been applied in your district. And I will say for the US, there's many US laws that we're working to track. So please feel free to use the feedback form on the site if we're missing any from your jurisdiction. So we have the database organized by life cycle category, as I mentioned. That way you can see if you're looking on reduction laws, whether that be banning a plastic bag, or you're looking at more of some of the foundational, like plastic production, whether that be like air emissions or water emissions, what is legal. You can really look at what types of laws have been applied all over the world to address these issues and organize them, as I mentioned, by the portion of the life cycle category. Many of the laws will incorporate multiple parts of the life cycle category and will be displayed as such. So as I mentioned, we're really looking to exemplify effective policy as well. The database is very much intended to be more of a resource for scientists, for legislators, for journalists, for advocates. When inputting the law, we try to not incorporate any bias, for it to just be explicitly what is in the law, so that it's useful for all sectors. However, we do provide some commentary to try and point us in the right direction of effective policy. So we have examples of best of their kind policy on our notable legislation page. Policy is always evolving and it's not a one size fits all, but we pull out some of the best of their kind, and also some guidelines for drafting bills. We also have detailed overviews on false solutions, so policy and mechanical instruments that have been used to try and address plastic pollution that we know will fail, such as chemical recycling, which is just a fancy word for incineration. We also have policy analysis and effectiveness studies on different laws, and then context from local experts. This is super important. In the age of AI, there's a lot of scrubbing of the internet that can be done. However, as we mentioned, laws are like poetry in how they are translated and then also in how they are described for their impact on community. So we have a global network that is inputting these laws and these resources. And I'll say that this was really built for the movement, for people across sectors working on this issue, whether it be businesses looking to have compliance with their laws across their supply chain, or it be legislators looking for new creative approaches to policy, activists looking to track progress and see where opportunities still lie. We built this for the movement. It really is the primary global resource. And we know that it's going to be a critical resource in all possible scenarios for this UN plastics treaty. So with a UN plastics treaty, it becomes a really incredible tool to actually track progress. So not only looking at how countries have ratified this into their law, but also what laws that they have passed to meet that commitments in a treaty. In the eventual or the possible case that a treaty is not enacted or that the process is further delayed, the database becomes the primary space for global initiatives to align, for people to track progress, to again find best of its kind legislation, to coordinate policy in a way that the treaty is designed to do. In the absence of that, this website can be incredibly effective and is only growing. And all of this is ultimately done in the hopes of advancing strong plastic laws that not only stop plastic pollution, but its toxic impacts on people and the environment. It's a big hurdle. We have lots of work ahead of us, but as I mentioned, the movement's growing. We're super glad to have you here learning about it, and hopefully we can plug you into the movement so that we can only be stronger. Awesome. And I'm going to quickly, once I stop sharing my screens, share some links. I have a recap blog from INC 5.2, a way to sign up for our newsletter. We send monthly updates about advocacy initiatives, policy initiatives, solutions that you can implement, even businesses that are doing it right. And then I will also share the Global Plastic Law link again. Thank you. I saw Dana shared that in the chat. Super appreciate that. And my contact email is here. You can reach us at coalition@plasticpollutioncoalition.org.
Thank you both very, very much. We have a few questions. I think this is a good one to start with. Ellyn asks, can you please, where did it go? Explain the petrostates. Like, what does that mean and what's the impact?
Yeah, so I can jump in. So when we say petrostates, it's countries whose economy largely relies on fossil fuels or petrochemicals, so some like the chemical feedstocks for plastics. And I think it's some of the usual players that you'll see in other UN spaces that are largely, I would say, impeding progress on cutting down fossil fuel use and addressing climate change and the health impact. So in the UN Plastics Treaty space, they are going by a name called the like-minded group. So it's actually the countries that are involved have not been explicitly defined, but we know it's countries like whether it be like Saudi Arabia, Russia is involved. You'll see just a lot of countries from the Middle East who have strong petro economies. I will say the US has been increasingly aligning with the like-minded group. They have not explicitly participated or stated, but with the new administration, we've seen that there has been a much weakened position on the UN treaty and closer alignment with some of these petrostates. I'll pass it to Luz if I missed anything.
No, you covered well. And for the last negotiations in Geneva, actually, the U.S. sent letters to certain countries telling them not to agree to a treaty that included uh, the production reductions of oil, because it's again, as Madison mentioned, is used for the plastic production.
I have a question for you both to sort of piggyback off of that one. What is ultimately the reason that a few like-minded countries can kind of derail the process so much?
Yeah, I can hop in. I mean, I think it's a variety of different factors. So one, as I mentioned, right now the negotiations are working based on consensus. So it's really if one country objects, it can totally slow the progress. So that's one of the reasons that we're really pushing for voting so that it can be a majority decision as opposed to consensus. But I also think it's global powers that we've seen the US has been actually threatening increased tariffs for countries that take what they consider a too ambitious position. So it's not only the leverage that they have in the room through consensus and through I'll say financial contributions. That's a really key concern is the US, for example, puts a ton of money or previously put a ton of money into the United Nations. So we need the countries who are perpetrating the problem to help fund the solution. But then there's also the power that they hold, and whether it be economic, whether it be you know like whether it be related to war. There's the whole global mix of powers and intricacies that are like playing out really through these negotiations.
I think the economic power is one to be highlighted. Also, when you see the lobbies from the industry outnumbering the member states and people who are at the negotiations, that's a key play. In the previous year, the United Nations Environmental Program has hosted side events in the different locations where the negotiations were happening. These side events were obviously on site, but also online. Last year, the United Nations Environmental Program had no side events. The side events were hosted by the petrochemical companies that invited member states to come to these meetings and again money talks. And so yeah, it's a big problem.
Ethan, I think you flagged a couple questions in writing, maybe?
Yeah. I mean, there were some that came up in the chat, and I just kind of went through there. I see that the global plastic laws database link was put in there because people were curious about that. Are any of the laws relating to the hundreds of thousands of acres of synthetic turf that are regularly replaced? So has this been addressed on the international level at all?
The negotiations have no language for this.
Mm.
It's about plastics in general, uh, single-use plastics production. Turf is not part of the conversation. I'm not sure if Madison has seen anything different than that.
Yeah, so I can say Plastic Pollution Coalition has been involved in some of the advocacy for laws either banning or phasing out synthetic turfs that we know it can be associated with some really serious health harms. If you've heard about like soccer goalies getting lung cancer, it's a really important issue, and I'm really glad you bring it up. As far as the database, we specifically only cover laws that have been passed. And this is very much an emerging area in plastic policy. We aim to update the database on a continual basis and also to expand the topics that are covered. But I would say right now, because there's very few, if any, laws that have been passed, they're not as well represented. But if you sign up for our newsletter, we'll definitely be sharing more information on some of the efforts.
So it looks like Laura has placed a comment in the Q&A about someone has to start banning plastics first. No import, no export, keep plastic produced at home. So do either of you want to comment on the import-export situation and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, so I would say the waste management is a really critical part of the um, treaty negotiation process because right now you'll see that the biggest plastic producers, the biggest plastic users, whether such as the U.S., are shipping our plastic to other countries that then have to deal with the problem and the toxic health impacts. So it's a very complicated space, I would say. I'm by no means an expert on it, and its interplay with Basel, another waste management mechanism. But I will say on your point that someone needs to be first, Rwanda actually has one of the most ambitious bag bans, where they're not only banning its use or the sale, but prohibiting manufacturing, import, use, and sale. So it's a very comprehensive. Again, Rwanda is small though, so it's difficult to have like an international influence, but I would say it starts small and then we grow from there.
Also, within the United Nations, yeah, waste management is being addressed, especially exporting of waste to other countries. And you got to realize that when you're talking waste, you're looking at contamination with plastic as a means of economic development for developing countries. Bali is one of the nations that also, and again, anything related to legislation needs to happen at the country level because the United Nations is not going to have legislation that needs to be. It doesn't happen. The United Nations has no rights to impose legislation into countries. Countries need to look at the treaty and based on the treaty negotiations, come out with legislation in their own countries. In relation to the export of waste and plastic, as an economic development tool for developing countries that do not have the infrastructure to deal with the amount of plastic and the impacts in their own economies and their health and the environment. They had to come up with their own um, regulations for exports. And you have seen in Bali, for example, a legislation that actually began with teenagers uh, who started working on the plastic pollution and how this is affecting the tourism economy. I believe Malaysia, and don't quote me on that, also has had were actually a shipment of plastics coming from the US, from Europe, and from Japan, when Japan is considered one of the best examples for how they manage plastic, and excuse me, plastic is going all over developing countries, had actually stopped those shipments and returned to the countries of origin, which creates a whole problem. And again, the protocols, the legislations have to be developed in country, not through the United Nations.
Yeah, I think this also brings up for me one of the foundational issues with plastic is that it's currently marked as incredibly cheap. And that is because governments are subsidizing, whether that's the fossil fuels that are used to create plastics or the plastic production themselves. So taxpayer dollars are actually making plastics cheaper. And then the cost of managing the plastic pollution is then bared by the community. So whether that be your like city taxes on waste management or that becomes the waste export to other countries, we need plastic pricing to actually reflect the true impact and cost on society. And so we have been part of efforts with the Quaker United Nations office where they've been trying to quantify global subsidies for plastic pollution and continue to advocate for that to be part of the treaty text. I think, it's right now it's difficult, whether that be the individual at the grocery store looking for, well, there's like a bottle of ketchup and the plastic is always cheaper than the glass bottle, or it's a small business that's looking at their cutlery and trying to decide what they can afford. We need the price to reflect the cost, and it does not currently. And once it does, it'll allow us to, really spur the shift to whether it be regenerative materials like seaweed or hemp that are used for plastic packaging, or reuse systems that avoid some of these single-use products altogether.
I think that's a really good bridge in the last couple minutes here. I wanted to see if the two of you would like to comment on a couple comments that we have in the Q&A in the chat, which is we can refuse to buy plastic container products. And let's see, someone else says it is the duty of every individual to take responsibility for the acquisition, use, recycling, and disposal of plastics, even in the absence of mandatory laws. So I was wondering, in this context of, national and potentially international legal framework, and the systems that both of you were just talking about, including the economic systems, I wonder if you could make a few final comments on that individual versus systemic situation.
Yeah, so I can say we vote with our dollars, right? Like what you buy, you are supporting. So when you have like the fiscal capacity to make better choices, I absolutely support that. And I'll say, like, if you are someone who's trying to reduce your plastic waste, the key things are to look in your kitchen and on your food and beverages. If you want to like really reduce plastic and protect your health, start there, make the fiscal choices that you can, whether it be buying a pitcher filter to avoid hundreds and hundreds of single-use bottles, or again, trying to buy some of the unpackaged products. However, I'll say that the systems are actively working against the individual right now, whether it be the subsidies I mentioned that are creating falsely low costs for plastic, or it be some of even the recycling symbols that are actually not based on recyclability. So it's really a systemic problem. Individual action can really, show whether it be legislators or businesses that we want them to address it. However, we know we need systemic change as well. It's we cannot take on the petrochemical like industry, the fossil fuel industry with the individual choice. We need our governments to take action and to regulate some of these systems.
I agree that this needs to be dual, the individual choice and obligation. We actually have a moral obligation because plastic, microplastics especially, are impacting even the unborn child. And with we had the purchasing power, as Madison mentioned, but we also need to enforce regulations at the local, state, and federal, because this is a problem that is global, and if we do our own part at home with our families, with our friends, spreading the word, it's good, and it's good, but it's not good enough. We need legislation. We do. And I want to make a comment too. When delegations go to the negotiations, countries communicate with each other to the things that they need to do. So yes, there was a comment about the U.S. sent letters to Geneva. The U.S. sent letters to specific delegations that they wanted them to say no to capping of production. So yeah.
Excellent. Thank you both very, very much. I just want to highlight and elevate Plastic Pollution Coalition as an organization, and Luz's chapter of Beyond Plastics, which is Beyond Plastics Mo, Wisconsin, based in St. Louis. Both are excellent organizations to get involved with and to get information from. So I thank you both so much for being with us tonight. And everyone, that concludes our Plastic Advocate series. Please follow up, share the YouTubes with other people, and please contact any of us if you have any questions or want to take action.
Thank you. Now I will share my my PowerPoint has some resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Luz.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
thank you, Dana, and everyone for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you all.